It's an open secret. The deep state is working hand in hand with Silicon Valley's social media tech giants like Twitter, Facebook, and Google to control the free flow of information. And that includes suppressing, censoring, and sometimes outright purging dissenting voices, all under the guise of fighting fake news and Russian propaganda. Most recently, it was revealed that Twitter's senior editorial executive for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa is an active officer in the British Army's 77th Brigade, a unit dedicated to online warfare and psychological operations. In other words, he specializes in disseminating propaganda. Now, the news left many wondering how a member of the British Armed Forces secured such an influential job in the media. Yet this bombshell was not even covered at all in the mainstream press, including at the New York Times, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, or Fox News, meaning this information didn't make it to most Americans. But for those paying attention and for those who have been following Mint Press News' extensive coverage of social media censorship, this revelation was merely another example of the increasing closeness between the deep state and the Fourth Estate. The world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon and one of the United States' leading newspapers, The Washington Post, was paid $600 million by the CIA to develop software and media for the intelligence agency. It's a move that media critics warn the end of journalistic independence for the Post. Meanwhile, Google is working hand in hand with the State Department to control what you see in search results. In former CEO Eric Schmidt's book on technological imperialism, it was heartily endorsed by deep state warmongers like Henry Kissinger, Hillary Clinton, and Tony Blair. In their book titled The New Digital Age, Reshaping the Future of People, Nations, and Business, Eric Schmidt and fellow Google executive Jared Cohen wrote, "What Lockheed Martin was to the 20th century, technology and cybersecurity companies like Google will be to the 21st. Another social media giant partnering with the military-industrial complex is Facebook. It announced last year that it was working closely with the neoconservative think tank, the Atlantic Council, which is largely funded by Saudi Arabia, Israel, and weapons manufacturers, to supposedly fight foreign fake news. Now, the Atlantic Council is a NATO offshoot that advises the president on how to go to war, and its board of directors reads like a rogues gallery of warmongers, including the notorious Henry Kissinger, Bush-era hawks like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and James Baker, former head of the Department of Homeland Security and author of the Patriot Act, Michael Chertoff, a number of former Army generals, including David Petraeus and Wesley Clark, and former heads of the CIA, Michael Hayden, Leon Panetta, and Michael Morrell. 39% of Americans and similar numbers of people in other countries around the world get their news from Facebook. So when an organization like the Atlantic Council is controlling what the world sees in their Facebook news feeds, it can only be described as state censorship on a global level. After working with the council, Facebook immediately began banning and removing accounts linked to media in official enemy states, like in Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, ensuring the world would not be exposed to competing ideas, purging dissident voices under the guise of fighting fake news and Russian bots. Meanwhile, the social media platform has been partnering with the US and Israeli governments to silence Palestinian voices that show the reality of life under Israeli apartheid and occupation. The Israeli Justice Minister recently proudly revealed that Facebook complied with 95% of Israeli government requests to delete Palestinian pages. At the same time, Google deleted dozens of YouTube and blog accounts supposedly connected to the government of Iran. And just in the last week alone, Twitter purged several Palestinian news pages, including Quds News Network, without warning or explanation. Electronic Intifada co-founder Ali Abu Ni'ma wrote, "This alarming act of censorship is another indication of the complicity of major social media firms in Israel's efforts to suppress news and information about its abuses of Palestinian rights." The vast online purge of alternative voices has also been directed at internal enemies, from Julian Assange to Chelsea Manning. And as attempts to retighten the state and corporate grip over our means of communication increases, high-quality alternative media are being hit the hardest, as algorithm changes from the media monoliths have deranked, demoted, deleted, and disincentivized outlets that question official narratives, leading to huge falls in traffic and revenue. Last year, nearly 1,000 alternative media and journalist accounts were completely purged from Facebook and Twitter. The message from social media giants is clear. Independent and alternative voices are not welcome. One casualty in this propaganda war is Daniel MacAdams, executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, a public advocacy group that argues that a non-interventionist foreign policy is crucial to securing a prosperous society at home. Now, MacAdams served as Senator Paul's foreign affairs advisor between 2001 and 2012. Before that, he was a journalist and an editor for the Budapest Sun, and also a human rights monitor across Eastern Europe. Now, MacAdams, who spent much of his time on Twitter calling out the war machine supported by both parties, was recently permanently banned from the platform for so-called hateful conduct. His crime? Challenging Fox News anchor Sean Hannity over his hour-long segment claiming to be against the deep state while simultaneously wearing a CIA lapel pin. In the exchange, MacAdams called Hannity retarded, claiming he was becoming stupider every time he watched him. Yes, despite that word and its derivatives having been used on Twitter over 10 times in the previous minute alone, and often much more aggressively than MacAdams ever used it, only MacAdams became victim to Twitter's ban hammer. Something didn't make sense about this ban, and one only needs to read the replies under any of President Trump's tweets to see far more hateful speech than what MacAdams displayed to suspect foul play. Now, I spoke with MacAdams about the ban and began by asking him if he accepts the premise of the ban or if he believes something else was afoot. Check it out.
Yes, I was banned for Twitter. I was accused of hateful conduct for attacking someone based on a disability. And this is because I tweeted about Sean Hannity, the fact that he was wearing a CIA pin while attacking the deep state, that he was acting retarded, which is an offensive word, but it was used as a term of ridicule. It was not an attack based on someone's disability. It wasn't an attack, and Hannity doesn't have a disability. He is not mentally retarded that we know of. So therefore, their claim is completely illegitimate. That the question is, are Twitter's terms of service a contract or an implied contract between the user and the company? If they are, I would say that I was not in violation of their terms of service, but in fact, Twitter itself was in violation of its own terms of service because it permanently banned me based on an accusation that objectively was not true. So the question is, if the rest of us, or at least some of us, have to abide by Twitter's terms of service, why doesn't Twitter itself have to abide by its own terms of service? And if you happen to point out objectively that their ban is not logical, doesn't make any sense, they simply ignore you, or they will continue to send you the same boilerplate language saying that you have attacked someone based on a disability, which you obviously haven't done, at least in my case.
Now, Daniel, state officials like Marco Rubio can literally threaten foreign heads of state with murder, like he did with Maduro. Or Donald Trump can threaten entire countries with nuclear annihilation. Yet their accounts are never suspended. Is there like some sort of golden rule for state officials versus one for those who oppose them?
I think it's partly true that people with the blue check marks who are well-known public figures can get away with a lot more than the average viewer, but I think there's more to it than that. For example, the other day I was looking around, and when Senator Rand Paul had agreed with President Trump that it's a good idea to take the troops out of Syria, and he was attacked from both political parties, by the neocons, by all the elites. Underneath it posted on Twitter, someone call his neighbor, which is obviously a reference to the neighbor that attacked Rand, obviously a call for Rand Paul to be physically attacked and harmed because of the position he took. That person, of course, had impunity in what they said. They were not banned, unlike myself, who just used an unpleasant word to describe Sean Hannity. So I think it's more political on Twitter rather than simply the binary politics of left versus right. I think those that challenge the Washington narrative, particularly when they get too much traction, are the ones that are targeted for removal. And I think it shouldn't be any surprise when you look at the kinds of organizations they partner with to determine who should and shouldn't be on their platform. Things like the Atlantic Council, which are funded by NATO and the US government and the military industrial complex. They don't want people out there that are challenging war from the left, from the right, from the center, from a libertarian perspective. They just want to get them off. That's why some people get away with a lot and others are punished and disappeared for a lot less.
Well, there's obviously been a great deal written about Russian trolls' influence in Western societies and politics, but the power they have to shape the narrative really pales in comparison to Western governments and what they've done to manufacture propaganda online. How concerned are you over Western influence online?
I think the U.S. and Western governments are very active online. They're very active in trying to control the narrative under the guise, ironically, of combating fake news. What they do is they combat Americans and West Europeans who have different views than the dominant paradigm of the global U.S. military empire, and any country out there that dares challenge it must be liberated or sanctioned or overthrown. And I think that shouldn't be a surprise, again, when you look at who the fact checkers are, who these organizations partner with, partnering with things like the German Marshall Fund, which is funded by Western governments and military-industrial complex, looked at the Atlantic Council, again, as I mentioned earlier, which is funded by Western governments, NATO, and ironically enough, funded by Burisma Holdings. There was a fantastic expose done by Max Blumenthal recently of how Burisma Holdings, the famous Burisma Holdings that hired Hunter Biden at $50,000 a month to be an expert on energy, hired him. This is the same company that is now a major donor of the Atlantic Council. How do you think they feel about people who have a different view about what happened in Ukraine in 2014, have a different view of Ukraine after its liberation? This is what's happening. Follow the money and you'll find out who's controlling the social media.
And as somebody who's obviously worked in politics, you've advised a presidential candidate in the past, you've worked as an editor, as a journalist, you've worked in media, and now you've been banned completely from participating on Twitter. What do you think the future holds for social media? I mean, will it become an increasingly controlled space that we're starting to see, or can that trend be fought against and won?
I think social media is too powerful for the elites to leave alone. The elites in government and at the top of business and banking, et cetera. It's too powerful to be left alone. Individuals, myself and many others, of course, more prominent than I, who have developed followings, who had developed followings on Twitter, who people look to for informed commentary. Twitter gives people a platform in my case, to challenge in real time the lies being told by the neocons like Pompeo and Bolton and the others when they talked about things like Venezuela and when they talked in favor of regime change, when they talked about attacking Iran. We could challenge in real time on a factual basis the things they were claiming. And a lot of people would say, yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to use that. So I think that's too powerful. And that is why government, in partnership with these companies, with these social media companies, has exerted control, has disappeared people. We see in Hong Kong now, people who have been disappeared on Twitter for challenging the narrative that this is a peaceful democratic protest, and anyone who says that the U.S. is involved is disappeared. Over and over you see this happening. What I would like to see happen in the future of social media, and I don't know what the technology is a kind of social media system whereby it's not a central hub that can be easily controlled by special interests, where you have your own social media profile that you carry with you that can't be banned, and you can simply, if you don't want to hear what someone else, if you don't want to hear what Daniel MacAdams says, you can block him and not listen to what he says. You can block anyone you don't like, so you have the power in your control over what to do, rather than have it some very, very non-transparent group of people behind the scenes with no names and no faces deciding that you violated the terms of service, therefore you are disappeared down the memory hole, off to the gulag, off to Siberia.
That was Daniel MacAdams, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace. Thank you so much.